There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Leave. Start your adventure. Remember, the project is due a week from Wednesday. Start by finding the assets on our servers. We can't give you those files without a password. You'll need to speak to IT. This is the first I've heard of this. I need clearance from my manager. This will get you in. Yeah, that'll work. I'll open it up for you. What the heck is a GZ file and how do I open it? Go to the Valley of Shareware. Hey, listen. Hey, listen. Hey, listen. What? You should do some work on that project that's due soon. You're a crappy project manager. I don't understand why this design is taking so long. I'm doing the best I can. So this is a comic. And 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 the amazing thing about comics is they transcend genre. They can be funny. They can be about superheroes. They can appear in a newspaper, a magazine, online, anywhere. The best definition I've found for comics is this. This is from the comics great, whose name is escaping me right now, Will Eisner. And he calls comics sequential art. And it kind of makes sense because you can have art or an illustration. But this isn't necessarily a comic. Even if you added a character and some text, this still isn't a comic. It's just an infographic. But sequential art, that's a really good definition. It's this idea that we're taking images or photography or anything and putting them in a sequence to communicate something to you or tell you a story. So my name is Brad, and I draw comics. Sometimes, usually they appear on my website. Sometimes I have the opportunity to have them appear in books or magazines. But my day job and what pays the bills is that I am a designer. I kind of fall somewhere in the middle between user experience and web design, where I do a little bit of both worlds. And so over the years, drawing comics on the weekends and doing my job as a web designer on the weekdays, I found that there is a ton of overlap between these two topics. And so for a while, I've been thinking, how do I take all these things and ball them together into a talk? I know there's a talk there, but I couldn't find a theme. So I've been thinking about it for a while, and I've kind of grouped it into these three chunks. The first is the aesthetic, which is they're both visual mediums. So in all of them, you are actually looking at something and you're using the visuals to communicate with your audience in some way. There's the intentional aspect of it, which I'm going to dive into deeper in a little bit, and then there's the interactive element of it. Now, the web obviously is an interactive medium. I also often call myself an interactive designer. Comics maybe aren't as much of an interactive medium, yet at the same time I've found that many of the things I've learned from comics have affected the interaction portion of my job the most. So we'll start with part one, which is the aesthetic. So early on, my very first class, my very first semester in college was Graphic Design 101. I forget what it was called, like Visual Communication something or other. It had some highfalutin name. And the very first project that the professor gave to us was to make one of these, this poster. And I still have it to this day. And everybody in the class made this, and we have all these design principles laid out on this poster. And she made one too, and she hung it on the wall. And so I would go home and I'd work on my projects, and then I would refer to these design principles while I was working on it, thinking, how can I make this better? And so then we'd go in and we'd have these like big critiques where everybody's sitting in the room, all the students, and we're looking at our work on the wall. And I always, to this day, years later, remember, like, if your design's not working, the professor would say, so which one of these things can you use to make your design better? And she really pounded these principles into my head. But there's 10 of them. They're kind of hard to remember. So shortly after college, I discovered CRAP, which is like the kind of condensed, modified version. And that stands for contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. And what you'll find is that almost all visual mediums use these elements to communicate effectively. So like the first one is contrast. If we take a look at this red and this bluish color, they look like two totally different colors, but when we mush them together, we see that there's not like a ton of contrast between them. It's kind of easier to see if I put it in an illustration. So here we have a bottle of water, and we can see the projector makes it look really good because it's kind of washed out, like where the blue hits the pinkish red, it kind of mushes together just a little bit. And if we like took all the color out of this and turned this black and white, you can see, wow, those things, there's no contrast between the foreground element and the background color. Now if we change that water to a glass of milk, well, now we have a lot of contrast. We have a really defined edge. And so it's much easier to see, and it makes it a better illustration. And when we knock that out to grayscale, now we really get a sense of what we're looking at here. So there's different kinds of contrast, right? We have color contrast, which is kind of what I was talking about. There's shape contrast, size contrast, which we see a lot in web design, and comics as well. This is from an X-Men comic book. So what we have here is a fantastic example of size contrast being used, because we have this giant foreground image which takes up like half the page, and then we have this middle ground, and then we have this background thing going on with these smaller characters in it. So that's size contrast, but we also have a really strong color contrast going on here, because the foreground is kind of this dull bluish color, kind of washed out, so it's kind of all meshing together. And then the middle ground, there's no color that's really popping out, but then you've got this yellow in the background, and that yellow is like screaming at you, which you might think, why is your attention being called to the background with this powerful color? So we'll zoom out and take a look at the whole page. So what's happening in this comic book is there is a group of people who are getting a tour of the X-Men school. And on this tour, what the artist has chosen to do is color all those tour panels this kind of yellow color. And then as the people go through the comic, you get different glimpses of what's going on within the X-Men school, and it introduces you to different characters. So it's using this color to kind of guide you along this path so that you don't get lost as a reader. So what's happening here is the first panel, we're on a tour. The second panel, the tour, which is the yellow in the background, is actually seeing something happening in the foreground. So it's almost like in a movie where you cut to another scene. That's what's going on here. So it's using that color contrast to do that. And then at the end, we cut back to the tour on this panel, and they're like, oh, it's yellow, I get it. That's where we're at. So this is an example of yellow being used again on kind of a desaturated image to really stand out. You see the logo, you see the big button, and those contrasts like, woo, big time, jump out at you. But there's some other like contrast elements going on here too. Size contrast. We've got a giant headline and a smaller headline underneath, and that contrast creates kind of a nice visual balance. It also has some smaller icons at the side, and I love that the small icons on the side are each like a different shape. So it's kind of a neat way, again, we have shape contrast, so it's kind of a neat way to differentiate those elements on the page. So those are examples of like high contrast, but there's kind of subtle ways to use contrast too when you don't want to overemphasize elements. So in this case, we have a download button, which is orange, which is probably why you've come to this page, to download something. But next to it is the donate button. Most people probably aren't going to donate, but they want it to be prominent, and so it's not as bright, it's not as orange. So this is an example from a comic, and what I love about this is this feels like my home. Like if I drove 10 minutes away from my house, I could see this scene, right? Because you've got kind of a rural area, you've got a water tower, some mailboxes, and then that third panel, you've got kind of a factory in the background and a fence and stuff like that. But what I love about this is that I can really relate to this. This really sets the tone. But it's using subtle contrast to do that. For example, that factory in the background. Usually when illustrators put a factory in any scene, we have mental images of what a factory is, right? A factory is belching out pollution. There's oppressed workers, right? There's all these visual elements that a factory like brings up for you when you think about it. But here you don't get that because they're using a very subtle contrast to just be kind of like, hey, this is a Midwest Rust Belt town. There are like old factories in the background. It's just part of the setting. It's not what you're supposed to be focused on. So it's using that subtle contrast to just add an element to the background that you shouldn't really focus on, but it's kind of there to set the scene. Cool. I'm glad this shows up on the projector. So this is another example of subtle contrast where we don't want to call a lot of attention to these three different elements, but we want to say that they are three different elements. So we do that by making this area like a little bit darker than the other areas around it. And so you'll see that as a way to kind of block off elements on a web page. This is very subtle, but this is something you see a ton of, and that is like someone will use a light gray or off-white background, and then this is a white box. I don't know if you guys can see that. It's very subtle. And what that white box is doing is it's saying, hey, all this stuff inside this white box, this should be grouped together. So if we had put this in like a blue box or an orange box and we made this big and orange, your eyes would go right to it, and that would become the focal point of the page. But we don't want that. We just want to say, hey, this stuff belongs together. You know, think about it as a sidebar on a website. You might put like a subtle line around it just to say, hey, these elements are grouped together. We don't want to call your attention to it. We just want you to know that these things belong together. So next up is repetition. So that's the Star Wars trilogy. What'd you think? That was so awesome. Are there any other Star Wars movies? Nope. So this is something you see in comics a lot, especially gag comics, where oftentimes in a comic strip you can like change the angles and do exciting things and show action lines and close-ups of people. Unlike a movie where it costs a lot of money to do special effects, in a comic you could just draw special effects. It costs just as much as not drawing a special effect. But by keeping these things, repeated elements in there, it lets you focus on the dialogue and you can really get to that punch of that like stalled out in panel 3. This is from Chris Ware and one of his comics. This comic is called Jimmy Corrigan, the Smartest Boy on Earth. And it is the most mundane comic you will ever read, but that's kind of what he was going for. Because you think of comics as this, like, you know, it's either Snoopy doing something crazy or, you know, Garfield eating lasagna. It's kind of over the top. But in here, it's not over the top. And he's using a repetition of colors. He's using a repetition of panels over and over again, similar postures of this father character over and over again, to just show how normal and boring and mundane life is. And that he used the comic medium so well by using the power of repetition to do that. So in web design, yeah, go for it. Oh yeah, so you're talking about the X-Men comic at the very beginning? Or this one? I think what's happening here is it's a subdued color palette. And since he's using the same colors over and over again, so it's kind of hard to see on the projector, but this is the same shade of brown, same window color. So really, if you counted up all the colors on this page, he's only using like 5 or 6 colors. And so by doing that, he's just, if you use a lot of colors, it becomes exciting, right? Because then you have a lot of color contrast and you've got a lot of stuff going on. And by only using a couple colors, he's just kind of saying, nothing exciting here, nothing going on, you know. It's just boring. But that's kind of what makes it an awesome comic. So on the web, we use repetition kind of in similar ways. We use them to establish patterns. So in this example, we have a bunch of news stories, and each news story looks the same. So a news story has an image, a headline, and some text underneath it. And then you repeat it, image, headline, text. So as we go down the page, we can see it over and over and over again. These are all stories. But then we hit this one. And this looks totally different than everything else on the page. And it's still a story, but it's a featured story. We wanted to call attention to it. And so what the artist has done, or what the designer has done, I should say, is they have used repetition to create a pattern so that they can then break the pattern to create excitement. This is another example from comics. And this is a comic about identical twins. It's called The Manhattan Projects. And what happens is you follow these 2 identical twins on 2 different storylines through the first couple books, and you can't tell them apart because they look identical. And so it's using color changes. It's repeating this red color or this blue color so you can kind of follow along that story and understand whose story you're in at any given time. And another thing we see in comics a lot is this. Meanwhile, in Gotham City, you don't see it in comics as much anymore because they've gotten more sophisticated. At least the artists have. And so, for example, this comic is using a lot of browns. It's using a lot of like just the same color palette. And when I turn the page, I get to something totally different. All of a sudden, it's blue, it's darker. There's something different going on. So when we look at these pages together, if we were thinking about this in terms of a movie makes a scene cut, and you kind of understand, oh, the characters have changed, the setting has changed, the colors have changed. And comics have started doing the same thing. So instead of specifically telling you, hey, we're changing the scene now, we're going to a different place, now we're using color and we're using the artistry to kind of identify that so you don't necessarily have to be that direct about explaining it to the audience. So on websites, we see this too. So on USA Today, the life section is purple, and the money section is, wait for it, green, right? So we see this a lot, and it happens in branding as well. So if I'm on the Verizon site, I'm used to everything being red. That is my brand. My brand is red. And when I jump to another site, now we're dealing with orange. Our brand is orange. So you know that you've jumped to a different section, a different site. And so we're using color and the repetition of that color to establish a brand and an identity and a place of where you are. And then there's alignment. So at first glance, this comic looks kind of nutty. There's a lot going on here on this one page. But it does kind of all work together, and partly that is because of alignment. One, we've got a strong alignment along the sides. We've got like a panel floating down here by itself, but that panel lines up over here. We have all these circle panels, but they line up with the thing below them or above them. And then there's the staircase in the background. So we're using these strong alignments to create relationships among a bunch of objects that otherwise might just seem like they're floating there. So on a website, we often build grid systems to accomplish this sort of thing. Like here, we've got a bottle, and we've got some text, and we've got some images down below. But when we turn on the grid, now we can see that, okay, everything's kind of lining up here. This is kind of an intentional thing. And as we scroll down the page, we get to a section of the page that is like, looks completely unrelated to everything else, but still it's sticking to that grid structure. So on an inside page, again, we're on the same site. It looks slightly different, but if we turn on that grid, we're still sticking within that structure. So we're still keeping everything in place. And so even if we scroll down and we break outside of that, if we break outside one of those grid lines, we're still within the 3-grid structure when we get to that image. So designer Morgan Knudsen used to work at Google, and while he was there, he was observing that like the setting screens on Android had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 alignment lines, right? And he was like, well, we don't really need 8 alignment lines. We can just kind of move things over and align things on like 3 or 4 alignment lines, right? So by reducing the number of alignments you have in your designs, you create a sense of order. So back to here, part of the reason that we can have the bottles kind of going up over that background image is because we've already established a grid and we've already established that pattern. So when you break that pattern, it creates visual interest. So next up is proximity. So in comics, oftentimes, from a storytelling standpoint, it will pull you back and say, okay, here we are in Metropolis, and it's Superman and somebody flying over the city, and maybe then we zoom in a little bit to give you a little more context. Okay, I think he's talking to Lois Lane there, and okay, so now we're going to zoom in a little bit more, and so now we know like what the character's about, and then we can kind of carry on with the rest of the story. I'll wait for that one. And so we have that in web design as well. So we tell stories all the time with our sites. Like we'll start with this big hero image. There's also visual proximity. So in this case, what we have is I look at this and I think, okay, these elements here, this all feels to me like this belongs together. But why does this feel like a chunk and this feel like a chunk? And why does this not feel related to that? Well, it's because of proximity. There's more space in between these elements than there are between these elements here. And so what that does is that creates a relationship just by the proximity of the elements together. Since these guys are closer together, we see this, this, and this as being a related element. This comes in handy when you're designing a really text-heavy website. So this is the Daring Fireball website, and what we have is it's all text. There aren't any images. But what he has managed to do with this design is he's added more space here than there is between like the headline and the date and those sort of things to say, hey, this is a chunk, the logo's a chunk, this is a chunk, right? Proximity defines what elements are related to each other. This is Bootstrap, just vanilla Bootstrap out of the box. And it works well, and a lot of people just install it as is and run with it as a basic website because I think it does proximity really well. For example, you've got these 3 chunks here, and they've added a little extra space here, but I still know, hey, that's a chunk. And then there's a little more space here, which tells me this is not related to what's above it, but these 3 things are related. A little bit more space here, which tells me that's a different chunk. And even when we're at the end of a section, then we've got our H1 down here, and there's extra space between those things. So this proximity is telling us, hey, these are the related elements. These things should be read together. I'm going to throw one more into crap because I think it kind of fits, because if you put the H in there, it's like silent, but it works. And that is hierarchy. And that's the idea that you have a large element of the page that you're trying to show someone first. So when we look at this page, we know exactly what we should be looking at. If you come to Southwest Airlines, chances are you came here to book a flight and look at your flight information. So the most important thing to do might be this. So it's still strong and dominant on the page, but they've added this big image with the headline, Warm and Fuzzy Winter Fare Sale, to kind of say, hey, this is big, this is important, this is something we want you to see. So it's not necessarily distracting you from what you maybe came there for, but it's also large enough where it's not fighting and competing with it. So they've used size differentiation to do that. So now we're going to go to the second part, which is your intention. So it's Tuesday, December 18th. Okay. This looks bad. Here we go. This looks bad. I don't know what to do with any of this stuff. All knots. Screw this. Come on, Clint. I'm just going to cut the green wire. Cut it? What? There's probably a better way than this. Probably. And yet, Clint. That was stupid, Clint. It's just knotted up. Then you untangle them, Tony Stark, genius Superman. So I love superhero comics, and this is Iron Man, and this is Hawkeye. They're buddies, and they fight crime and aliens together. But on this particular day, they're fighting a home entertainment system. So when we take a look at these panels, we have the opportunity for a lot of chaos. And you might say, okay, how am I supposed to read this? But actually, there is some intention behind it. So for example, how do we read a normal comic? The same way we read text. Start on the left, we move to the right. Did I say that right? No, we start on the right, move to, I don't even know. You guys tell me what I'm doing. When we get to the end of the line, though, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the next line, and we're going to read over again. So this is fairly normal for comics. In some other countries like Japan, it's the exact opposite. But for the most part, the intention is clear of the way the reader is supposed to read. And I love this Jared Spool quote, and that is, design is the rendering of intent. And I talked about the beginning part, kind of the aesthetic piece of design, but if there's no intention, and if you're not trying to communicate something to somebody, then it's decoration or it's art. But intent, I love that word. So here, our intent is clear. It is to read over, and then go down, and read over again. So even if we shake up that layout a little bit, and we put a big panel in there with some other panels, we still have a pretty clear idea of what direction we're supposed to go. We hit that big panel, and then we go over, and then we can go down. But what if we change that around a little bit? What if we put the big panel on the other side? Then we hit that spot, and we're not sure if we should go down first or we should go over first. We've kind of broken the intention of what we're trying to do. So when we look at a page like this, at first it looks a little chaotic until we apply a grid to it. And then you're thinking, okay, it makes sense. I start on the left, and I go to the right. And then I go to the next line, and I go over again. And then I go over and over. So even though there's white space, and even though there's some blank panels, we can still kind of read it and understand what's going on here. So here's an example from a comic. I love this comic. It's called Dresden Codec. And it's really well drawn and really well written. But he is not the clearest visual communicator with his art. So where to start is easy. I'm going to start here and go to the right. And then I think I go to the right again. But I'm not sure, because this area, to me, it feels different. It's colored different. There's different characters. Something different's going on. So in my head, I'm thinking, maybe I'm supposed to go down instead. But then do I go over to the same kind of colored area? Or then I read up this way and then down? I'm not really sure. Like, the intention isn't really clear. So here's another example. Oh, did you? Yeah, go for it. I was getting thirsty. All right. No problem. So what's happening in this panel is, again, we know exactly where to start. We start on the left and we read over, but then we hit these panels on the right. Okay, I should go down. Visually, makes sense to me. I have no idea where I'm supposed to go. As a comic reader and as someone who reads a lot of comics, I should know this. Like, a new person maybe can't figure it out, but maybe I'm supposed to go backward, or maybe I'm supposed to jump to the front. To this day, I've read the comic 6 times, maybe more. I still don't know what to do. So if we think about this in the context of design, oftentimes we have to think about our audience and what our audience understands. So for example, I bet everybody in this room knows exactly what this thing is, and they know how it works and what to expect from it. But not necessarily everybody on the internet understands what this is and what it does. And this has been shown by studies, user studies, and that sort of thing. And also, you'll see it on mainstream websites. They'll label it with like a little menu button. So it's like, hey, this is a menu, just so you know. I think that's backed up because if we look at Time's mobile site, we kind of get the same feel where it's like this big pop-up that's like, hey, guys, we have a navigation thing right here, right? We have to kind of go over the top with it. So don't get super mad at me because I'm like not trying to steal all your hamburgers or anything. I'm just trying to kind of point out that, you know, just because we're familiar with something doesn't mean our audience is familiar with what we're supposed to do. And again, Jared Spool has this great concept that he calls the scent. So think about it this way. I think he uses the example of the bloodhound, and a bloodhound has the scent, and they're going through the woods after a criminal, and if that criminal crosses a river, the bloodhound loses that scent. And the users do the same thing on the web, and the same thing in comics. So what has happened here is I hit that panel, and I've lost the scent. If each one of these was a page on a website, I might go over here and say, nope, that's not what I'm supposed to do. And I'm going to hit the back button and try again. We're kind of going to visually do the same thing in a comic as we're reading it. So this is Sports Illustrated. Again, they have a big menu. They have the hamburger menu, but the word menu next to it. And I'm going to scroll down the page, and I'm going to see like this Pinterest grid thing, and it kind of asks, like, is there anything here that looks interesting to you? And I'm like, yes, the Flaming Horseman looks interesting to me. Click that. So I didn't think I was looking for a Flaming Horseman, but that's pretty awesome. So I clicked in, and the whole page like slid over. I don't know if you saw that animation effect. That was really cool. Kind of a nice JavaScript animation. Not what I was looking for, but I'm glad I came off on this little tangent. Let's check it out. Let's see what's going on here. Oh, okay, so it's a slideshow of weird stuff in sports. Cool. So I'm just going to close it because I wasn't looking for this, and I saw something I was looking for, so I'll just go back to that previous page I was on. Oops. This is a video. I double-clicked it. There we go. Oh, it took me back to the top of the home page. So even though I'd scrolled to the bottom of the page to find stories I was looking for, it has totally lost the scent for me. So to do this cool JavaScript slide-in thing, we've lost something. Me, actually. We've lost me. So that's what's happening here in this comic as well. We lead you down a path, and then we're like, good luck finding out where you're supposed to go next. So in comics, comics were originally kind of written for kids. So this is a Spider-Man comic from like the mid-'60s, and I can take a look at this without reading any of the words, and I know exactly what's going on. Spider-Man is saving some astronauts. But all that started to change after a while because artists in comics started getting really like fancy and thinking, hey, let's do some really cool stuff with our media. So this is an X-Men comic from the like mid to late 90s, and we've got this big long panel that you read down, and then you got to jump to the top of the page, and then you kind of go to the right, and then back to the left, and then downish. I don't know. There's kind of this weird path that you're taking through the page just because someone thought it would be kind of cool. Because it was around that same time that we started, like, as web designers, experimenting with Flash animation, kind of doing the same thing. Like, can we make this cool? Can we make this exciting? So there we go. That's like 13 seconds to find out where to download a Winamp skin right there. So as a general rule, the idea here is that when everything is exciting, nothing is really exciting. Because what we're doing with our visuals is we're creating patterns so that we can create excitement by breaking those patterns. But when everything is jumping around and flashing and cool, it's hard to tell what to focus on. So I work with a developer quite a bit, and he's always bringing me some really cool JavaScript-y things because he loves his JavaScript. And he can never figure me out because sometimes he comes to me with something and says, can we use this? Can we use this? And I say, oh, no, that's awful. And sometimes he brings it to me, and I'm like, yeah, let's use that. And he can never figure me out. Like, when's Brad going to say yes? When's Brad going to say no? And so I've been trying to come up with a simple rule, and I think I have this one, which is do the expected in an unexpected way. So we expect the web to behave in a certain manner. We expect a website or an app to do a certain thing. But if we can do that certain thing in an unexpected way, usually we're pretty safe. So if you decide that a hamburger button is a good idea, maybe after you press it, then you have to have a way to close it. So this idea that a close button is going to replace the hamburger kind of makes sense. That's expected. But maybe we can do that in an unexpected and cool way. This is my drink break because I think it's just fun to sit here and stare at my little animated X. So on the web, we see good examples of this and bad examples of this. So this is this next company is a watch manufacturer in California, and what they've done is decided to hijack the experience of their website by, if I scroll a little bit or scroll a lot, the same thing happens. It starts to autoplay. So I don't have control over my website while I'm scrolling here. It's just kind of taking it over, and it's doing its own thing, and I've got to wait for it to finish animating before I can find the information that I'm looking for. It looks cool. I'll give them that. It looks amazing, but it becomes kind of frustrating to use. Here's a good example, and this is one where I think I know what the designers are thinking. So this is one that uses a lot of parallax effects, so as I scroll, there's all sorts of neat stuff happening with the art in the background, and you can see I'm not scrolling very smoothly. I'm not doing the poor designer's website any justice. But I like the fact that I can scroll at my own pace. You know, it's kind of unexpected that all that stuff is going to move, but I like the fact that I still have control over it. It's still behaving like a website the way I expect a website to behave. Even though I know for a fact there was some designer who's probably designing this thing, and if he saw the way I pause now with like the headline half chopped off and too much space at the bottom, would probably be freaking out, because I know I would if I had designed it. But at the same time, as a user, I'm so glad I have that control and they didn't hijack my scrolling. So to just kind of recap, doing something cool and neat and fun can be exciting, but there's sometimes some downside that we don't see coming. So the third part is interaction. So this is a comic. What I love about comics as sequential art is that they're in a sequence. There's an implied passage of time between panels. So here, what this character is doing is he's using his phone and he's talking to some customer service person. There's a passage of time that happens between those two events. In fact, we could put a panel in between them and say he waited, and now there's more time that has passed between those two events. We could add even more panels, and he waited even longer. We could add a lot of panels, and he waited a long, long time on hold. It's telling a different story based on how much of that time has elapsed. So if we think about it from a design standpoint, what we're doing here is we're defining a feature. The first panel and the last panel are that feature. The feature is I can call and make a reservation. But what happens in the middle, that's our user experience. So I do this a lot. I make wireframes. I spend way too much of my time making wireframes. And wireframes are really great tools for a lot of different things, which is why I spend a lot of my time making them. But they're not really good at showing interaction, showing that kind of user experience element of it. So this is a chart I designed. It's one of the more boring things I designed, which is why I included it tonight. What we can do, though, is we can modify this chart. So I'm just going to go in and change, like, maybe this axis over here. So I can open this up and do that, and then there's a little thing to label my axis. If I was going to put that in a wireframe, I might label it something like this. Choose a form label from the dropdown, or you can type in a new label. So that's my wireframe. But that doesn't show the interaction or tell the story of how that would actually work. If I was going to do that, it would probably look more like this. So we've got a drop-down. Click my drop-down. I choose New Label. Then I type something in. And from there, once I've typed it in and saved it, then it's added to my list, and I can choose another new label or move on or do whatever. So designer Dan Mall, I think, does a phenomenal job at illustrating this in some of his comics, where he'll create these little interactive things, where instead of just leaving one donate button on a Photoshop page, he's actually saying, hey, can we do a rollover like this? Can we hide like this like $25, $50 learn more stuff underneath the donate button? Can we, you know, because it's a book website, so maybe it flips like a book. So I love the fact that he's kind of trying to illustrate that experience in some way. So I often think about wireframes as kind of like a movie script. Just because you hand somebody a movie script doesn't mean that you have handed them the vision for the movie. There's a lot of little things that have to happen from the time that the movie script is made to the time it actually becomes a really good movie. So in movies, they actually kind of turn these into things that look like comics. They call them storyboards, but it's kind of the same idea, where you're pacing out each scene with a series of like graphical images to show what's going to happen. This is one from the movie Titanic, and a lot of you have probably seen this movie. This is like the famous scene from Titanic where it's showing like the boat is moving forward, and then we want the camera to pan around the people, and then we want a top-down view, and then we want to pan around again, right? So it's using arrows to show this stuff, and we don't have, in visual design, we really can't just label everything because it gets annoying to tell you, like, hey, this is how you take a photo with your phone, thanks, you know? So in comics, we have decided to show like this kind of visual movement in different ways. So this is one of the comics we read earlier, and in that first panel we have Iron Man's eyes, and I love that they're right here at the top of this frame, and it's kind of looking down. And look what he's looking at. He's looking at this green wire and this red wire. It's start in the corner and go down, and then we're at Clint's eyes. They're right down here and they're looking up. So that comic is meant to be read fast. That comic is meant to kind of have this sense of alertness and the sense of fast movement to it, and the artist is playing with his visual designs to kind of accomplish that by like pushing you forward at all times through these panels. So I was, for a while, working at a company called Designing Interactive, and around the time that I had started, this was like 3 or 4 years ago, it was a bunch of us who were working as freelancers or independents, and we were kind of joining forces to kind of do larger projects and work. And we had worked together on a contract basis before, but we were kind of formalizing it as a company. And how I had worked is sometimes I'd do the wireframes, or I'd work with someone who did the wireframes, and then I'd get those handed off to me, and I'd do like visual design, and then I'd hand that off to someone like Adam, wherever Adam is, and he'd do like the front-end development. And then we'd throw it at some angry developer because we didn't leave him enough time at the end of the day, and he'd give us the stink eye from the other side of the room for the next 2 weeks. So this was our process. It's the traditional waterfall, we've seen it all before, process. And as responsive design became a thing, and as we became better at experience design, and as we worked more with development teams who are already kind of establishing these agile processes, we were finding that our design stuff, the stuff that I was doing, was really lagging behind. And so around that time, we all started working together, and so we were like, okay, well, let's throw out these processes and learn something new. And I think a lot of people in our industry were kind of in the same place at the same time. So we were starting to think about this, like, let's run in parallel. Like, developers tend to do this a lot. Why don't we do this with design? So sometimes I'm pairing up with a development person as the UX person. Sometimes the visual designer's working with a front-end person. Sometimes we're all working together in conjunction on things. Sometimes this worked. Sometimes it was a disaster, but it was a totally different kind of disaster than what we were used to, so we felt like we were making some progress. What we really discovered was the important step was, as soon as we can, we all had to kind of get on the same page early in the project. And that started with the kickoff meeting. So oftentimes in the kickoff meeting, we would talk to the client, or we'd have a brief from our project manager or whoever's running the project. And then from there, I might work together with a developer, and we just might go to a whiteboard and just say, okay, this is the app we're building. As simple as we can, let's not detail things out, let's just say, this is the app we're building. And the developer and I, right there, are on the same page. If we had time, and if it was a small enough app to do it, a couple times we had the opportunity to do paper prototypes. It was kind of the same idea, where we'd go to a note card and we'd just draw out our designs. We'd scan them in to our phones, and we use something like InVision to add like hotspots to it. So here we are, the same day we had our kickoff meeting with the client, we're actually sending the client something and saying, tap through this, tell us if this is something you can use. And it was great. Fantastic tool. So our process looked like this. It was a project management nightmare, but it seemed to start to work a little bit better for us, which is everybody kind of had to be in early on. And then maybe the UX person would go off on their own for a little while, and then maybe I would go off on my own for a little while. But there was always this kind of like check back with the person who has to take over for you next, check back with the person who handed it off to you, kind of this kind of very collaborative way to work. So that's kind of how I've wrapped up these things that I've kind of learned from comics over the years into these three modules. So I hope that maybe you guys took 1 or 2 things away from this, and I truly appreciate your time. Thanks for having me. All right. right, so one last thing. Now this is a little self-promotional. So, and one of the reasons I agreed to come down here. So up in Cleveland every year, has anybody been to Rust Belt Refresh? Okay, a couple of you guys. So it's a one-day front-end web design conference. Last year we had Kara McGrain and Jeremy Keith and Jen Myers and a whole bunch of people come out and speak. So it's one day. It's a lot of fun. It's up in Cleveland. And so we literally just set the date in the last couple days. So it's going to be September 25th. We haven't even tweeted this out yet. So far we only have 2 speakers lined up. We have Eric Meyer and Ren Lanier, who used to be a Columbus person, but has since moved south since it got cold out. So yeah, we're kind of really excited about some of the stuff we have going on, and so yeah, if you're interested, go ahead and sign up for email updates on our website. We'll probably have some stuff going on and have speakers announced by the end of this month, early next month. We won't spam you. We only send out like 3 or 4 emails a year, but you know, if anybody's interested, go ahead and sign up. It's a good time. Cool. Thank you. Oh yeah. So yeah, if anybody has any questions or wants comic recommendations or anything along those lines. Oh yeah. Yeah. So the question is you often see websites where things don't line up with the grid. Sometimes it's bad design. Sometimes it's because the designer decides it doesn't matter. The thing with a lot of these things that I kind of showed at the beginning is that they're not. You don't have to use everything. So it's kind of like these are your tools that you have set out in front of you, and what are you trying to communicate? And oftentimes you just don't need every tool in your backpack in order to pull off the job, you know. And so sometimes that's the case with alignment. Usually alignment is actually really important, and oftentimes you'll see like this site is just center aligned because it's like, well, there's not much content. Aligning things left to right would make it look really wide, so we just center aligned everything. But oftentimes you will see at least 2 side alignments, you know, kind of like this is the definition of the side of our site, and you'll see like various elements. In responsive design, it's a little tougher to do alignment because if you're using percentages, those percentages are based on the container which those elements are within, and so oftentimes what's happening is those are breaking down. If I didn't have 200 slides, I'd jump backwards. I might do it now. Anyway. So let's see. So one of the examples I show here it is. I'm willing to bet that when the designer put this page together, they had like this bottle perfectly aligned with that. Because when you actually look at the grid, it's off by a little bit. Or maybe they didn't have the bottle. I know what it was. I bet you anything. When that Photoshop comp was put together, those like 6 pixels right there, those are totally perfectly aligned with it. But when you actually, you know, it's a CSS button. So when you put real text inside a button, it depends on what browser you're in. If you're in Internet Explorer, it might be 4 pixels wider. If you're in Firefox, it might be 3 pixels narrower. It's just font rendering is going to change from engine to engine. So you can't always have every single thing on your page align perfectly. It's just kind of the reality of the world we're in. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that's such a little thing. I think overall, it's one of those things where if something doesn't align, no one's going to notice. The designer who designed it will totally notice, but everybody else in the world will never ever notice unless you throw a grid on it. So on the web, it's total inexact science. You know, if someone expands the page to 110% because they want to read the text bigger, all your alignments are gone anyway. So it's just, you know, but it is kind of nice to have. And even as we scroll down this page, the fact that this kind of aligns with what's above it, I think is a really nice touch. Because if I just turn off that grid, this is its own design in and of itself. It's not related to the rest of the page in any way, but the fact that it's on that grid, it's kind of like as you're scrolling, you're like, oh, okay, that. You're probably not consciously thinking of it ever, but for some reason your mind makes that connection, you know, and it doesn't feel out of place. It just feels natural. That's what alignment does. Cool. Any other questions? Someone asked me about color. Go ahead.
Well, I was actually going to ask about the website. Because, like, to me, this website is very, like,
Mm-hmm.
I like to look at the news website. It's just, like, so I don't
Yeah.
know if this website.
Yeah, I think so. Any website that's a marketing-driven website is probably going to be cleaner and neater, and they're going to spend more time on it than a news website, which is like we need to get as much information packed in there as we can, which is like the time and the Sports Illustrated examples and things like that. One of the ideas here is this idea of white space. I don't know if I have any good examples of that. Apple's website's a brilliant example of that, actually. So the idea so on a content site, you don't know what's actually going to go in those boxes. It's like it's going to be something sportsy here, it's going to be some headlines over here. But on a marketing website, I'll use Nest instead. They've left a lot of dead space over here and over here and over here. You know, there's just a lot of space in between things that you're not going to see on a content-heavy website. And part of what that implies is that when there's more space around something, it says this thing is valuable. So on this site, it's saying this product is valuable. If everything was kind of crammed in there and cluttered, it kind of goes back to that. What am I trying to focus on? What's really important on this page? What is trying to grab my attention? And so on a lot of marketing sites, you get very simple and clean designs. And on a lot of content-driven sites, it's a totally different animal because, one, they want to get you as much content as you can because then you're going to feel like, oh, this is really valuable. There's a lot of stuff here. They also want to throw ads your way because that's the way they make money. You know, so you're just going to get more stuff crammed in there, and it's because it's not as valuable to them to do it this way. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah, I'd say that's just better design. Cool. Anyone else? Yeah, go for it. Yeah. So what's a good color combination, color theory kind of thing? Like, yeah. So in general, I focus more on contrast instead of color. So when you're picking colors, I would pick colors that look good on top of each other. So the example I showed at the beginning that had the blue and the red, they're very similar in contrast. So that the red is not going to show up really well if you put it on top of the blue, like if you have a blue background with text on it. So I always look at contrast first. If your contrast works, you can make pretty much any color combination work within that kind of framework. It's just being able to put those two colors on top of each other and differentiate them is way more important than the color. And then there is a bunch of stuff on color theory, which is another talk, which is like red makes people angry in this situation, you know, or not so much angry, but a lot of times I worked on a client for 2 strong years, and it was a huge redesign of their internal applications, and their company colors were red and black, and so it made for really dynamic looking sites. But also we were designing interfaces that had to alert people, like if it was for call centers, so call center managers were using it to manage like what the wait time was and stuff like that, and so we couldn't like. Their color was red, so like we ended up using all these grays because it's like we can't make the buttons red because when they see red within that application, it was like, hey, your wait time is over 20 minutes. Pull the trigger and bring more people in to help you out with your call center. So like color theory does come into play a little bit there, but from a marketing standpoint, I think it matters less. You know, obviously red means stop, green means go. A lot of people choose blue because it's very neutral. Nobody has any bad feelings about blue. Green, green usually means, hey, this is earthy, friendly, environmental. So yeah, there's a bunch of stuff on color theory, but I think contrast way more important than color. Just making sure you can tell those two colors that you choose, or three colors, just being able to tell those apart when they're next to each other. Yes?
What's your favorite comic about that design? Is it the Brad's?
No. Shoot, you got me on the spot. There are some new ones. Okay, so there's some that have popped up recently, but I don't know them off the top of my head. And they're done more on the development side of things, because development is way harder than design, in my humble opinion. And so there's a lot more funny things that happen in development than that happen in design. So I'm going to go with that. The only one that's coming to mind, though... Well, okay, can I choose XKCD? Because that's kind of that's a math comic, though. That doesn't count. There's...
I'm giving you a chance to plug your own.
No, I haven't drawn... See, I used to draw a webcomic about web designers, but I haven't... I stopped drawing it in like 2012, so there's nothing to plug there. Sorry. There's something squirrel. CSS squirrel? Or... No, that's not it. I can't remember what that comic was called. It's Kyle Weems is the illustrator. It's pretty funny, but you have to be really nerdy to get it. It's something squirrel. Search for Kyle Weems, you'll find it. So if you know, it's like so nerdy that you have to know like what's going on at the W3C at any given time to really get some of the jokes.
Yeah, it is CSS Squirrel.
Is it CSS Squirrel? Okay.
Cool. I just want to call out one thing. Thanks to Cardinal and Kevin, people that's still here. They do a really, really good favor for us to open up the space and find the food and drink. So I do know that they're looking to hire some people. So if you're interested, feel free to talk to Kevin. Cool. Thanks, guys.